So the staff asked me, actually, if I would be willing to do a movie night with Inside Out. Our staff is a big fan of this movie, and I understand why. For me, it didn't have the same emotional impact as something like, say, if we're going to talk Disney Pixar, as, say, Frozen or The Lion King. For me, those two had a much bigger emotional impact, for reasons I'll talk about later. But I understand why the staff wanted me to show this movie, because it has at its core a presupposition that's near and dear to our hearts, which is that all behavior and all experience has an intended positive behind it, that there is something important about all our experience. And so this movie delves metaphorically into the positive intention behind the experience of emotion. So for me, part of the reason it doesn't quite have the impact is because you are, for instance, in The Lion King, where there is something heartbreaking and gut-wrenching, the wildebeest scene, if you've seen it, the wildebeest scene and what happens as a result of the wildebeest stampede is just absolutely heartbreaking. And so at that point, you're very emotionally engaged. And in Frozen, they break your heart three different ways in the course of one song. Do you want to build a snowman? Absolutely heartbreaking storytelling that gets you emotionally engaged with the characters. In this movie, because you're mostly experiencing the story through 5 emotions of a little girl. Well, she's actually not that little. But because you're experiencing it through the emotions, you're experiencing it through the emotion of joy, anger, fear, sadness, and disgust. And so these emotions are somewhat one-dimensional. It's a little harder to connect with them. But by doing this, they take us through the different things that, especially joy and sadness. The core of the movie is the relationship between joy and sadness. Originally, the filmmakers had wanted it to be joy and fear, but they actually found they didn't have anywhere to go story-wise with that. And so when they switched to joy and sadness, then they had a story to tell. Now, they've condensed the emotions, as I said, down to 5 emotions: joy, anger, sadness, disgust, and fear. How they come up with those 5, I'm not sure, because of all the 5 they could have picked. I'm especially curious about disgust. How disgust got in there is one of the big 5. But disgust and anger mostly show up in this film as sort of comic relief. And the main interaction, as I said, is between joy and sadness. They did a lot of study of brain science, actually, before doing this movie. They did quite a bit of research and talking to a local expert on brain stuff. There's something scientific. Glad we didn't have him come here. We thought about we asked him to come, but he only does paid gigs. But I would have been there saying, so tell us about this stuff that you do. But there's actually a lot of, in the background, brain science that backs this up. They have, for instance, although they've done it metaphorically, there's some accuracy in the way they show it, memory being stored. Also in the story, at some point, you'll see a memory and sadness comes and touches it, and it changes the memory. Now, that's actually true. If you're accessing a memory and you fire up an emotion, it will change the memory. When we're doing NLP work, actually, we do this on purpose so that we can access memories that are causing problems or limitations in our present and future. We access those and then we can actually change or color or revise the meaning that's running, which is a lot of what drives the emotion, and then someone can have a different experience. So we do that on purpose in our work, but it's actually accurate that if you access a memory and load up an emotional state, it will alter the memory. They also have in this movie, and if you're not interested in this part, don't worry, you can still watch a good story, but they have what's called core memories, and these sort of core pieces to this girl's identity. Now, in this movie, they're all fairly pleasant. And there's a certain time when the core memories become lost. And so looks like a long bridge to these certain islands, which is much like a neural pathway. And when the core memory is lost, the bridge to that island, it might be Goofball Island or Family Island, the bridge to that begins to disintegrate. This is actually what happens when you interrupt a bridge neurological sequence. The original sequence starts to degrade. Again, this is something we do in our NLP work on purpose. If somebody has an automatic unwanted response, we can interrupt that and the original pathway will start to degrade. So they actually included some science in a really lovely metaphoric way. Now in this, as I said, most of these islands were fairly cheerful. If one of the islands had been Worthlessness Island, that would be one where you wouldn't feel so bad if the pathway to that disintegrated, right? And so story-wise, this is a classic Odyssey form of story. So two characters go on a long journey to retrieve something that's been lost, in this case core memories. And on the way they go through adventures and challenges, as one always does in an Odyssey. They even go into the murky ground of the subconscious and eventually even into the underworld, where memories die. So it's a classic story. And the main character is a girl named Riley. She's 11 years old. Now, this is a very potent age because at this age, a person has 1 foot in childhood and 1 foot that's starting to step into adulthood. So it's a very important transitional phase. And one of the big challenges and gifts of adulthood is learning how to manage your emotions, include them, and actually appreciate what they offer. So as I said, this talks a lot about the intended positive, the good things that come from all experience. So almost no one would quibble with the good things that come from joy. Joy gets a pass on almost everything. Anger actually has a functional value. It lets us know when something important is threatened, or when something's not fair, which again is something threatened, a sense of fairness. Sadness lets us know that something important has been lost. Fear lets us know we're in danger, life in danger. Now, disgust, again, I'm not sure why they chose that to be one of the big five, but disgust lets us know that in some way our criteria or our sensibilities are being violated. So, this 11-year-old girl is coming to an age where she's going to need to begin to include all of her emotions, not just joy. Now for her parents, this is a journey as well, because parents often want to protect their children from any experience they deem as undesirable. And for many people, any experience other than joy is considered an aberration. So anger, fear, sadness, disgust would be aberrations that are to be rectified as soon as possible, instead of actually holding them as vital feedback between us and the world. Because our emotions act as our GPS, as our guidance system in the world. They let us know what's important to us. To us, not to everybody, but as our individual feedback. And so to take away that feedback would be like having a compass that never moved. There'd be no way to navigate if no matter what you did with the compass, it only said one direction. And so the parents as well, at first, are trying to keep their daughter. They want her to be happy because they want her to be happy. This is not unusual and fairly sane. But quite often when parents try to protect their children from what they see as undesirable emotions, it has the opposite effect. I had some friends who tried to protect their daughter. They didn't want her to get scared. They wouldn't let her watch scary movies. They wouldn't do anything that might scare her. And by the time, because they wanted to protect her, best of intentions, but by the time she was 12, she was terrified of everything. Because she had somehow picked up from them that she wasn't able to handle it. And so quite often when parents try to protect their children from their experience, they're unconsciously telling them you can't handle this, and the children have a harder time learning how to manage and include and appreciate their emotions. So in this case, it's a journey for the parents as well, although a shorter journey. And interestingly enough, when you're looking inside the girl Riley's head, joy is usually the one who's at the helm. When you look inside the mother's head, sadness is usually at the helm, and in the father's head, it's usually anger who's at the helm. So we're going to watch this in a minute. It's a lovely outplaying of the value and the beauty of our emotions. And in this, joy goes, the journey for joy is a learning journey. Because in the beginning, she doesn't know, she says, I don't know what sadness does. She doesn't know why sadness is important. And as a matter of fact, she spends most of her time trying to keep sadness away from ruining all these happy memories. And there is a part in the movie where there's some really needed information from a character they're trying to get, and the character's upset, and Joy is really frustrated, and Sadness goes and sits and commiserates with his sadness, and he has a good cry and gets over it and then gives them what they need. In this case, Sadness was able to accomplish something, a connection, an empathy, a sympathy, that Joy was not able to. And the filmmakers talk a lot about about sadness being something that causes people to come back together. That shared experience, shared sadness, and provides a move to reconnect, which, by the way, is different from grief, which unfortunately is fairly isolating. But, so in this movie, Joy comes to a realization of the value of sadness. Now, when I saw this movie, like I said, it didn't have as much of an impact on me as others, and I do have to admit that for a week after I saw this movie, I was so depressed. It was like all the sad parts of me that had been, exiled, they all came crawling out of the woodwork and set up camp for a week, right? Because they got re-included. But those emotions, those are what give our life texture and color and depth. No great painter would paint with just one color, and no great musician would compose with just one note. So these are the color and texture that actually make up our experience. So if you're ready,